pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Next is public comment. I haven't had anyone approach me. Kelly, do you? No? Okay. Well, then we will move on to approval of the August 8th, 2024 Extension Education and Economic Development Committee meeting minutes. Do I have a motion from Rosenberg? Second by Lemmer. And then all in favor? Aye. Aye. Oh, we have one comment from Supervisor Lemmer.
Just a tiny little typo with the amount of money in the child care note when we sent it back. There's missing a zero, so.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Zeros are important.
Yeah,
I appreciate you catching
comma's
that.
in the right place, but needs a zero.
All right. Thank you. Okay. Next, we are on to 5, policy issues, discussion, and potential committee determination. A, recommendation to Human Resources, Finance, and Property Committee and the County Board to amend the 2024 annual budget to transfer $200,000 of American Rescue Plan Act funds to address child care shortage through service contract. I'm going to hand this over to Administrator Leonard, and I just want everyone to know that Kelly Borchert is here in case anybody has any questions after Administrator Leonard is done explaining. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So within your packet, I believe beginning on page 4, so as you may recall, I didn't have the pleasure of attending your last meeting, so I watched it virtually on YouTube and kind of took the comments and the direction that the committee provided to really rough out what might be a purchases of services contract to affect what all of you discussed relative to the program proposed by Child Caring, to address the lack of availability of affordable, high-quality child care in Marathon County and kind of stem that tide. So I roughed that document out, again, beginning on page 4. In terms of kind of what the next step would be, again, based on the conversation that you seem to have at your last meeting, and I apologize if my recitation is inaccurate in any way, but the desire seemed to be to move forward with an amendment of the existing annual budget, the 2024 budget, to direct $200,000 of American Rescue Plan Act funds to go through that purchase of services contract approach. If that is in fact the desire of this body, I think in terms of process within your existing board rules, you would make that recommendation to affect that annual budget transfer for purposes of administration negotiating that purchases of services contract. That would then also then work through your board rule process, which would go to HR Finance and Property, and then ultimately the full board. But again, that is kind of how I saw that seeking to go based on your past discussion. And again, I roughed out that purchase of services contract, made a couple of changes to try to, from the presentation that was provided, that Kelly provided, to kind of get at that. And I know one of the areas was really how long do we want that clawback period, for lack of a better term, to be. So I believe in the document I put 2 years. But again, this is a draft, and in terms of how these services contracts generally have worked in the past, the board provides the general direction to administration. I would then sit down with Kelly and we'd, negotiate to put the finer points together and make sure everyone's on the same page. But all that said, the way I would see that moving forward, if you wanted to encumber those American Rescue Plan Act funds, it would be to amend the 2024 budget. Selfishly, Chris, Sam, and I met earlier this morning to talk about really that ARPA reconciliation, and the earlier the better, when we can kind of encumber those ARPA funds. So I would, if you want to move in this direction, working it through your process, go to HR Finance, which meets next week, go to the full board, perhaps even yet this month, for a budget amendment, and then I would negotiate that contract to make sure that I encumber those funds through a signed contract yet before the end of the year. But that's kind of how I interpreted your meeting. So happy to answer any questions, or if you do have concerns about feedback on the purchase of services draft contract, I'd be happy to hear them. But that's kind of where I see you sitting right now.
Okay, any questions, discussion? Vice Chair Pfeiffer?
Okay, there we go. Just so I'm clear, we're looking at the cost of the program would be $200,000 for 30 individuals. So we're looking at about $6,600 per individual. Is that all add up from my simple math?
I looked to Kelly at how they wanted it broken down. I put in the payment under contract section to essentially separate out. When I watched the presentation and saw the proposal, it was essentially 25% for foundational training program costs, and then $150,000 for the employer stipends over the term of the contract. I don't know, Kelly, if you wanted to provide any greater detail.
If you did the simple calculation dividing 30 by 200,000, I'm sure that's the figure that you came up with. Yes. I think we were determining it though based on the stipends per participant as well as then the teaching of the courses. Does that help you?
Yeah, thank you. I was just kind of trying to figure it out, and the clawback provision, I don't know, 2 years seems awfully short, but I know there's a lot of turnover, so I think that's fine. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? Supervisor Lemmer?
Thank you. If somebody does turn this back because they leave, what happens with the funds, being that they are ARPA? I guess that was, I think, a question we had asked, and I don't know if there was closure on that.
That's a great question. I drafted the agreement. I had that question in my head. I drafted it that they reimburse child caring. And I didn't have this conversation with Kelly, but my hope was one of the conversations you had is what does sustainability look like? They'd have to put, the thing I think we could put in there is you have to redeploy those funds within the program. So the idea was pay it back to child caring because I think that clawback gets you past the 2-year mark that you'd otherwise have for ARPA because you've already deployed those funds. But the service contract that we would have with child caring would require child caring to put those funds to similar use.
Anyone else? No? No? Okay.
Make the recommendation.
All right, well, if we have a motion,
I'd make a motion to recommend to Human Resources, Finance, and Property Committee and the County Board to amend the 2024 annual budget to transfer $200,000 of the American Rescue Plan Act funds to address child care shortage through a service contract as described.
okay, motion by Rosenberg. Do we have a second? Second by Supervisor Lemmer. And going for a vote, all in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Passes unanimously. Thank you. Moving on to B, discussion regarding 2025 annual budget development and policy recommendations from the committee, including review of the mandatory discretionary program document and discussion of rates and fees. 1, consideration whether direct administration to provide funding for participating in the North Central Wisconsin Tourism Partnership in the 2025 annual budget.
I can take this one too.
That'd be great.
I'm not overly familiar with the tourism partnership. It previously, as I understand it, was referred to as ITBEC. I don't know what the acronym stands for or stood for, but now it has been branded through the Wisconsin Counties Association as the North Central Wisconsin Tourism Partnership budget allocation. So beginning on page 58 in your packet, this is simply some correspondence that was received from the Counties Association that kind of talks through what the benefits are of entering into that partnership through the North Central Wisconsin Tourism Partnership. There are annual dues consistent with membership. The annual dues for Marathon County would be $3,729. The county does maintain memberships in a number of organizations, most notably the Counties Association and the National Association of Counties, but also in local chambers of commerce. So This would just be something that I don't have in my budget right now. It's not an overly large amount of money. It's $3,700. But if you wanted to direct me to do that, I'd certainly make sure we set aside those requisite funds within the county administration operating budget to do that. I'll try to answer any questions about what this organization does, but quite honestly, between the website and the letter, you probably have just as much information as I do. I know there are a couple county board members that have been on the board for some time that do recall the preceding organization, the predecessor organization, ITBEC, but really it's a kind of more destination marketing for relative to tourism for North Central Wisconsin.
Okay, any questions or discussion? Okay, seeing none, do I have a motion?
I'll make the motion to direct the administration to provide funding to participate in the North Central Wisconsin Tourism Partnership in the 2025 annual budget.
Thank you. Motion by Rosenberg. Do I have a second? Second by Seefeld. All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? No. Passes unanimously. Thank you. Moving on to B2, review of existing UW Extension programs and ranking of priorities, including but not limited to securing economic development resources to guide the administrator in formulating the 2025 annual budget. So I'll turn this over to Administrator Leonard too.
Thank you again, Chair Marash. So this is again based on the conversation you had at your last meeting and actually over several meetings. I know you've discussed a number of priorities. And you're a bit unique in terms of committees. You really don't have a whole lot of departments. Quite honestly, you don't have no direct county departments over which you provide oversight that are funded through the county's general operational levy. You, of course, have the library that comes before you, but they have an independent levy that is outside of levy limits. The only direct department that you provide oversight for is through UW Extension, which a number of years ago we transferred to a fully contractual arrangement with UW Extension. And thank you to Jeremy. He put in the packet the existing kind of breakdown of the programs that are offered through UW Extension in those program areas. You certainly have more than what I think makes sense to talk about today. In terms of, you have FoodWise, which you've gotten updates on in your packet as well, but that really is simply it's a nominal match on the part of the county. We have to provide office space and general office support. The primary areas that Marathon County has historically supported, at least through the last several years within UW Extension, really fall into a couple of direct funding areas, and these are, again, thanks to Jeremy for putting the contract in the packet, but it's 4-H education, agriculture extension educator relative to dairy, and horticulture education. We also have an associate education relative to 4-H, but it's really those three buckets. At least in my contemplation, you have the agriculture, horticulture, 4-H. Now, why? At least from an administration perspective, I think what would be beneficial is if you do have other priorities, I need to know that for purposes of the budget. If we're going to realign resources, then I would have to sit down and work with Jeremy to identify if suitable resources exist and what the costs would be. But I can't do that, and I won't do that from the administrator seat without direction from an oversight committee. So I went back and watched a number of your meetings to try to make sure I understood what other priorities you've discussed, and they really have fallen underneath that umbrella of economic development. So economic development, again, based on the discussion I've heard at the committee, can be things like the redevelopment of county-owned properties, River Drive, Thomas Street, tax foreclosure, redevelopment, so properties that are taken by the county through the tax foreclosure process, either in rem or through tax deed. I know one thing, probably about a year ago, we had from Extension in Bayfield County, Kelly Westland talked about some of the things they're doing, and one of the things I understand Bayfield is doing is putting covenants on existing properties that are going through the tax deed process to require that at least for a certain number of years they be owner occupied. So that idea of how can someone to work directly with existing staff and address the housing shortage through the tax foreclosure process. And then I'd also say just general housing issues have come up at this committee. You've talked about the lack of housing. And then lastly, there were a number of comments, particularly in light of the presentation from Chamber CEO and President Dave Eckman about the need to spur or stimulate economic growth through, a county economic development presence, kind of working with and collaborating with those municipalities to identify and whether it's engaging businesses or negotiate kind of business partnerships, those sort of ideas around economic development. So that was kind of the impetus in a conversation I had with Chair Marash to have a direct conversation if this committee wants to provide me that clear direction to do that. And then I reached out to Jeremy, and I think we have the opportunity just to help, and you get these reports pretty frequently, every month, at least in writing, really understand what UW Extension does in the areas that you already have educators, but then also try to understand what potentially exists from UW Extension relative to an educator and how those things align with your needs. And then ultimately, it's not very sophisticated, but kind of figure out where your priorities lie. So I put together a rough ranking sheet on kind of how you might individually do that, and then I can collect them. But before we get to that, I think the thought was hear from UW Extension staff to really better understand and allow you to ask questions about what their programming currently is, and then have a discussion amongst your group about how you think those various priorities, where they rank, or you don't have to have the discussion and you can just rank them. But that was at least the conversation Chair Marash and I had. So I hope I've done that justice, but if you have anything to add, let me know.
No, I have nothing to add. Well done. Should we invite Jeremy up to educate us? Thank you.
That's a lofty desire, I think, but thank you, Chair Marash. So I'll just go over what's included in the packet real quick. We have Heather and Janelle here, the dairy educator and horticulture educator. If you want to get into any details of those programs, obviously they can answer questions. Unfortunately, Holly couldn't be here, 4-H educator, but we can answer any questions there as well too. But just to go over what's in the packet, Administrator Leonard mentioned the contract that's in there. That's on page 60. That's this current year's contract, just so you had that as the basis. A little bit further explanation on that. The first two programs listed there, 4-H and agriculture education, those are what we call co-funded programs. So you're paying about half of the costs of that position, roughly. Extension covers the other part of that. And a note, in the past few months, we've transitioned into regional agriculture programs. So we actually have an additional educator, crops educator on board. We didn't include her programming in the packet because she's just getting started. There's not much to report yet, but you'll be getting that. So both she and Heather are doing programming in Marathon County. So next year's contract will recognize that. And then the positions listed below, those are the positions that the county provides, or at least is holding money for the full funding of those positions. So the horticulture education position, Janelle's position, is 70% in Marathon County, 30% in Wood County. But that's not a co-funded position. That's fully county funded. The 4-H extension associate educator, is actually paid for with private funds that come to the county, but that is the Leaders Federation who actually pays for that position. And then the administrative assistant, that's the support staff, that's a state employee. So that, I put the contract in there just so you have that kind of basis for the positions. And then jumping down a few pages we go to there's an insert in here about the signage, but down to page 66 through 70, we just laid out kind of year-to-date activity within each of those program areas. So you have the summary of the horticulture program, contacts programs that are being delivered, and then same for agriculture, dairy, and 4-H as well. So you have those details, and happy to answer any of those questions. And then going back up is just an overview. One of the discussions that we've had is kind of what is the focus of a potential economic development related position. I think Supervisor Robinson brought this up at the last meeting of, needing to be clear of what's desired for that. So I asked our community development program manager to kind of lay out a distinction between what is the typical kind of economic development director position, and Supervisor Pfeiffer can tell us if we got that fairly close, and then compared to like a community development educator. And these are, generalized, and obviously different in every county, but from the extension side, those positions are much more about capacity building, not kind of project management or doing, direct work with businesses, but more on making sure community development efforts are connected, have background in the research that's available, best practices, relationship building, all of those kind of things. So I just wanted to lay those out for you just so you could kind of think about what is the kind of desire for a position on one side or the other. So those are the documents there. So I'll leave it at that, and then we can jump into any questions or further details.
Okay, any questions? All right, Supervisor Lemmer.
Thank you again. Okay, so just a couple, what are we ranking for? Are we proposing to cut one of these positions? What, can you go back and talk about that ranking?
Sure. I think I can certainly give you what my thoughts are now, and I shared this in my meeting with you. Gotta love county budgets. They are what they are, and essentially all of the new money the county gets every year is essentially eaten up between two things. One are wages increases, and the other is going to be health insurance. So if you have a change in priority, that doesn't mean absent a new influx of revenue, that means you have to stop doing something. I'm not saying you have to stop doing something, but we can't do all things all the time. And that's really the purpose of the ranking. I put together, it's really sophisticated. It's a little box on an Excel spreadsheet with rank them 1 through 4, because that's, quite honestly, that's, I think, the options you have right now is you have 3 things you have, and you have 1 thing you've talked about, which you don't have, the economic development. Again, I'm not saying you need to make any changes, but I'm not going to make any changes unless you tell me I have to make changes. I've been called a lot of things, but I don't generally read minds. And I certainly don't take action based on my thoughts of reading minds.
Well, and just to, I guess, interject from where my standpoint is, having discussions on what our priorities are for this committee. We have discussed economic development as being one very large priority. In order to do that, and based on the budget, looking at some of these programs and the money that's being spent that we are looking at, we have to find the money from somewhere to put it somewhere else based on priority. So that's where this discussion is coming from. Is the money spent with some of these UW extension programs? Is that our main focus? Is that our priority? Or do we maybe need to focus on something else? So that's why we wanted to bring it to the committee and get everybody's perspective and opinions. Vice Chair Pfeiffer.
Thank you. Looking at what's presented, I think there was a good synopsis in the packet. Generally speaking, I don't think that having UW Extensions as our economic development arm is going to get us where we want to be ultimately. I think it would just be a duplication of services with some of the other organizations we already have that service our area. Between Synergy, North Central Regional Planning Commission, McDevco, Wisconsin Economic Development Association, Wisconsin Economic Development Corporation, and our chambers, there's a lot of different players in this space already. I think unless we were to do something game-changing, look at the Sheboygan County, Washington County models as something that really seems to be a game changer in those areas, and I think doing something like this isn't really going to move the ball as far as we need to. So I like the idea of looking at something a little bit bigger model. I think that's going to take us more time than to be able to put together a scope of that for this year's budget, though.
Supervisor Lemmer?
Yeah, that's what I was thinking when I looked at the chart that's on page 61, which I really appreciated. It seemed to me, because we already have these existing entities that Supervisor Pfeiffer mentioned, I feel like we need the coordinator to be able to dial in what they're all doing so we can figure out what our space is. And when I look at what the educators do, I'm an educator, I appreciate very much what educators do, but I don't think that's going to get us where we need to go. So I don't know how, though, to get that coordinator position. Is that a facilities thing? Is that a new position? You know, do we have anybody on staff right now who can serve as that coordinator? Or is that something we need to build and, you know, like Supervisor Pfeiffer said, plan that over the year?
The short explanation is I don't have anybody with capacity, assuming they had the skill. I don't have anyone with capacity to do the work. That kind of goes back to my last point. You need to thank you for your willingness to serve. You have to make tough choices. You have so many resources, you need to make decisions as to where you allocate them. So the short answer is no, unless we take something else off the plate. And the county board can do that. I mean, you do that annually through my work plan, and I've been tasked with a couple of things that I think are adjacent to economic development. But as is sometimes the refrain at the executive committee, is the recognition that, again, my position is only so much time in the day. So it's a priority setting question.
So would it be possible to create a position, maybe even short term, that would be a person that could work on RFPs and help with our excess properties, things like that?
100%. I think if, again, the way I like to look at it, during our budget orientation with Committee Chair Robinson and Board Chair Gibbs, we talk about, what is the role of the board is to set the strategic direction, identify what you want accomplished, and perhaps why you want it accomplished, and then staff figure out the how. I think that I wouldn't, absent it being a long-term desire and a long-term funding stream, I wouldn't create a new position, but at least not a new allocated position. We might hire someone on a limited term basis if I knew what the kind of identified funding source was and have job deliverables. We've done that with things like currently Erin Andrews that works with us for broadband. There's a defined amount of funding. Her position is a limited term position to accomplish those goals, absent the board ultimately identifying additional fiscal resources and additional work for that individual to do. That position would be due to sunset as well. So the short answer is yes, if you identified fiscal resources to accomplish goals and identified what goals you wanted. And again, I went back and just listened to your meetings and kind of heard the things you're talking about, and they were just as you shared. One of them is redevelop the parcels we have. I mean, the county has a fair number of significant assets that come the next several months are going to be vacated through our considerable consolidation, facility consolidation effort, the board needs to provide staff direction as to what you want done with those. And then someone needs to, as was said before, I think Jeremy referenced, like, project manage that. That doesn't happen in one day. If you're going to desire to put out an RFP relative to some development goals, engage potential developers, score those RFPs, come back to the committee. I mean, there is somebody in this room that does that as a job. So it's a lot of work. So again, short answer, we could absolutely find a way to accomplish it. Staff would identify the how, but we need to identify the fiscal resources to do it.
I was going to say, I think even what you're talking about, just from the RFP process to selection, that's maybe 20% of the overall scope of getting something to actual completion. There's a lot of management that goes into everything. It's really a constant process, checking in, seeing everything's going, what's the next step in the process. It's not just, great, we've got a proposal chosen that it can move forward. It's a lengthy process, years long in a lot of cases.
Supervisor Rosenberg.
There's no sustainable funding that we know of to do a position like that, grants or whatever it is from wherever it is.
Well, I can share that I've applied for, I think I shared this last year, I applied for a grant off the top of my head. I can't remember through what entity it was, for the county to have some economic development resources. I wasn't successful in the grant application. So in terms of sustainable funding that currently exists, I think right now the answer that I have is I'm not aware of any. I'm not saying something doesn't exist, but I'm not aware of it. One strategy we may have is, just the facilities I talked about. If the county were to adopt and identify a legal way to do so, a redevelopment strategy that at least for some period of time looked at long-term land leases for facilities with specific economic development goals, you could perhaps take some of those revenues from those leases to offset the operating costs or the personnel costs for a position. But I haven't done any financial analysis to say whether or not you have enough property and enough interest in those properties to essentially fund the position. I'm not an expert, certainly by any means, about how the city funds their economic development department, but I know it's more funding stream. There are quite a few revenue streams.
Supervisor Robinson.
I'm just going to speak off the cuff, but one of the, just thinking out loud, perhaps one of the ways would be is to look at the potential use of ARPA for a 2-year period of time, in taking that concept of the leases and or sales of property and to put that into a dedicated fund for the purposes of sustaining it over a period of time. It would be something we could evaluate if you were looking at a long-term fix. The question is, at what costs? Because, the tax deed property we've already paid for, we've bought out the other units of government. It wouldn't go back into the general fund, and then the sale of the property, it wouldn't go back into the capital fund. So you're making, in essence, a priority decision as to how to allocate those funds at the time of conveyance of the property to another entity, whether through lease and or sale. But it would be a way of, if you wanted to look at the potential for a longer term funding source, create a dedicated fund from a portion of those sales to pay for those activities. The question becomes, one is what do we envision that role to be? If it's just the sale of the properties, we've got River Drive, you've got social services, you've got a few other facilities that have high value and high potential interest. But there aren't a lot of other ones. There are parcels here and there for housing and other things. So I think what you'd want to do is try to define what your short-term and long-term goals are to see if they mesh, and then how you might approach setting aside funding for them, whether it's a limited term ARPA, whether it is a longer term sinking fund or sale proceeds fund.
Any other discussion, questions? Should we move ahead with the ranking sheet?
I think that's certainly entirely up to you. I put it together if you wanted to kind of go through the exercise of seeing where your priorities, kind of what the order of operations was, but I certainly want to make sure, UW Extension, if you have questions of staff, kind of what, there's a lot of good information in the packet, but certainly ask them any questions you might have. And otherwise, I'm happy to hand out what I put together based on what I thought you might want, but you don't need to use anything I put forward.
Go ahead, Supervisor Lemmer.
Well, I feel like based on the discussion, we wouldn't really need to get rid of a position to add a different one because we wouldn't be adding an economic development educator. And it's maybe too soon to even look at changing anything with how we're funding the extension, I mean.
Yeah, I interpret that as a question. I don't think, I'm not aware of a mechanism other than if you decide to go the route that was suggested by Supervisor Robinson. Essentially, you're identifying an external funding source, temporary, but nevertheless an external funding source for a new position, which would be the American Rescue Plan Act funds. If and that answers your question. If that's your recommendation, that would go through the process just like the first item you took up today, which was the budget amendment. Alternatively, their only way to tackle a higher priority is to reallocate existing resources. But to your point, if you choose a different short-term strategy to develop a long-term strategy, you're right. You don't need to go through a ranking process.
Supervisor Rosenberg.
Are people with the relative skills available to take those positions?
Not sure I'm the best person to ask that question to, but again, you have somebody in the room that probably has a much better sense.
Vice Chair Pfeiffer.
That's a tough question. I don't know what the appetite for people is for a limited term position. You might have somebody that's newly retired or at that point that they're looking at retirement that might take that opportunity. But what I've seen is just the job market has gotten softer and softer for just competition and getting resources like that. I can tell you just for my own personal example, when I graduated college for an entry-level planning economic development job, I applied and got the Dear John letter back. He didn't get the job and said there was 200 other applicants for an entry-level job. In my hiring for entry-level jobs in the last 5 years, I can tell you the job applications that are meeting the qualifications are much, much smaller, in the less than 10, sometimes less than 5. Now that's entry level. We'd be looking for somebody with a higher skill set than that. So that's the one thing that does concern me about a limited term position. If that's something that we would actually be able to find a good candidate that would be able to meet our needs and really be able to take the program, make it successful, because we don't just need a 2-year pilot program that's not going to go anywhere.
Anything else? Okay. We will add that to an agenda for a future discussion. All right, so 6, operational functions required by state statute, ordinance, resolution, or policy. A, discussion and possible action, none. B, discussion and possible action to forward to county board for consideration, none. 7, educational presentations and committee discussion. A, update on Marathon County destination marketing signage on highways 29, 39, and 51.
This will be a very short educational presentation, probably light on the education. So if you didn't know, we have kind of Marathon County actually is the tenant in a rental agreement, a series of rental agreements with landowners where the signs when you enter Marathon County are situated. Those rental agreements, I just picked one to put in your packet, beginning on page 63, as Jeremy referenced. There's kind of an insert in there of a rental agreement that lays out, yes, these destination signs, these entry signs are a 10-year lease signed in September of 2024. You'll see a picture of one of said signs on page 65. The leases are expiring this month in about a week. Talk about great timing. I was approached by the local destination marketing organization, the CVB or Visit Wausau is their kind of tagline. They were interested in kind of, hey, maybe we can update these signs. And I said, great, you can update these signs. The cost of the leases was not exorbitant. This one I put in was $0. It was with can't remember the entity, but it was something associated with one of the dams and power generation. But the other ones are with with landowners. I want to say they were $750 throughout the 10-year term, so not overly expensive. But the website this was really a collaboration, as I understand it. The website on the sign is wisconsincentraltime.com. That was managed by, I believe, McDevco, but the website is no longer active. So really there is a need to update those signs. The Convention and Visitors Bureau was interested in doing that. I made them copies of everything I had and wish them well as our leases are again expiring in about a week. If you want me to take some other action, please let me know. But otherwise, I'm just letting you know that that's kind of the strategy. I think it fits much more within their wheelhouse in terms of destination marketing to individuals that either live here, are visiting, or potentially looking to relocate here. And it should address some of the issues we've had with, again, the website going inactive. This is really at the core of their business, maintaining websites and marketing. So happy to answer any additional questions you guys might have, but it's probably something I certainly didn't know until earlier this year when Jim Griesbach said, hey, I've been holding these leases. I don't know what to do with them. And I don't think it's really anything that, if the county can find someone else to do it, that's better suited. It makes logical sense to me.
Any questions? No? Okay. We are on to 8, next meeting time and date, announcements, and future agenda items. Supervisor Lammer, do you have an announcement? Supervisor Lammer, do you have an announcement?
This is the start of our outrageous weekend, so
Stand up and show your shirt.
Yeah, so come on down to Wausau and the park, the 400 block, the museum. We're going to have a good time.
Thank you. Sorry to put you on the spot, but all right. 8A, committee members are asked to bring ideas for future discussion, and B, next meeting is Thursday, October 3rd at 3 o'clock. And I'll take a motion for adjournment, please. A motion by Rosenberg, second by Seefeld. All in favor? Aye. We are adjourned.
I was just looking at this signs like 2 weeks ago and was wondering about why do we still have Wisconsin Central Time? We still have this website on there that goes to our newsletter. It's not the most effective use of